Hi everyone, it's Olivia and welcome to this channel where we talk about Riso, zines, art fairs and conventions and all sorts of cool stuff. Now in this video we are going over Risograph printing file setup for prints. So not so much zines or booklets but more of posters, art prints and postcards. So this video is going to be more like a checklist of things to look out for and consider before sending your files to print. Now I'd like to remind you that if you are working with a Risograph studio or printer to print your pieces, to always check with them first as to their preferred file formats and specifications and conform your files to those standards. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so we're now in Photoshop and as you can see, I've prepared this magnificent file that we will be working with throughout the course of this video. So right off the bat, this is actually not a great file to be working with because the color layers have not been translated into grayscale, and a lot of studios will actually want you to send them grayscale files. And the reason for that is, first of all, it's an added step for the studios to translate this to grayscale for you. And second of all, if you don't translate this into grayscale and you send this to the Riso as is, it's not going to print right. And that's because the Riso reads colors on a value basis. So for example, orange inherently has a very light value. So if you send it over to the Riso, it might be printed too light. So that's why you have to translate this into grayscale and calibrate it accordingly. So if you want to learn how to convert these color layers into grayscale, I do have other tutorials in my channel that will teach you how to do that. And so I will link a playlist in the description section below. But yeah, step one, always grayscale your files. Alright, so here's my grayscale file, and as you can see, I have labeled my layers with the respective ink colors. So here's teal and here's orange. And so at this point, you want to check your dark areas. And if you're printing something dark with a large surface area like here, you want to tone that down to about 80% opacity because printing something this dark and saturated with ink might cause some irregularities in printing, and it might also cause the printer to jam. And if you want to see the printer jamming in action, please check out my perfect binding video. The first few clips are literally just the Riso jamming. Another reason why you want to prevent too much ink saturation is because as the sheets of paper are exiting the machine after being printed on, they just fall on top of each other, so they just sort of pile up. And if you have a lot of ink on the surface of a sheet of paper, that ink might transfer onto the back of the sheet of paper that is falling on top of it. And that's not very desirable if you eventually want to print double-sided. Alright, so next is sizing. So if we go into image size, you'll see that this poster is sized exactly at 11 by 17 or tabloid size. And also it's full bleed, so the colors are going to the edge of the page. The Riso masters don't actually allow you to print that large, and you're going to see that later because we're actually going to print this file. And so we recommend sizing it at a 1/4 inch smaller all around. So max surface area should be around 10.5 by 16.5 just to be safe, and that should already include your bleed. So let's resize this image because this is actually a pretty common issue that I see very frequently. So if we go into image size and we hit 10.5, you can see that the height is 16.227. So that's under 16.5, so we're good. And I'm going to hit OK. And I'm actually going to go into canvas size, and I'm going to turn the canvas back to 11 by 17. And so now, as you can see, there is this margin, which represents the area that the masters can't reach. So this is the area that can't be printed on. Alright, next is incorporating a bleed, which is another common issue that I see quite frequently. So if your print has art, text, color, or other graphic elements that need to reach the edge of the page, you want to include a bleed margin in your file. And that bleed margin is usually 1/8 of an inch or 0.125 inches. And the purpose of a bleed is to allow a printer to trim a little bit of that excess off to ensure that your art or graphic element or text or color is actually reaching the edge of the page. So for Riso, that bleed needs to be incorporated within the maximum surface printable area. of 10.5 by 16.5. Alright, so I'm just going to pull out a guide mark which will represent the edge of our sheet of paper. And then I'm going to pull out another guide mark which will represent the maximum surface printable area. So that is 0.25 inches in to be safe. And then I'm going to pull out another guide mark and go past that and go another 1/8 of an inch in to represent our bleed. So this little strip right here is going to be trimmed off in the finishing process, and that is to ensure that everything will go to the edge. So colors, texts, and art, and anything that you need full bleed on will get trimmed and will reach the edge. And that also prevents a white edge from showing by giving your printer a little bit of a wiggle room in the trimming process. Alright, so let's go over what a bleed is not, because people have actually sent in files like this. So if we open a new file and we create a postcard that is 5 by 7 inches, and we just make a bunch of random black squiggles that go to the edge of the page. If you send this to a printer and ask them to trim this and print it full bleed, the printer might come back with you and ask for an 1/8 of an inch bleed all around. That does not mean create a document that is an 1/8 of an inch larger, but just have a white edge all around it. A white edge is not a bleed, and it defeats the whole purpose of having a bleed. The purpose of the bleed is to allow your printer to have a bit of that wiggle room in order to be able to trim into the bleed to ensure that the artwork goes all the way to the edge. And so it's not enough just to make the document an 1/8 of an inch larger. If you have elements that require full bleed, they have to extend past your original trim size into the bleed margin. Next is registration marks. So you should ask your printer if they want you to generate registration marks, or if they will be the ones to be generating registration marks when they're working on your file. Because registration marks are actually a very important part of the Riso printing process because of its layering aspect. So you should leave some room in your print for the printer to be able to create or add registration marks. Registration marks come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and they can be generated in multiple ways. I personally prefer creating small discrete rectangles on the edges of the print, but I'll show you what they look like in Adobe. So if I go to File, Print, and I go into Printing Marks and check Registration Marks and hit print. So these are what registration marks look like in Adobe, and they look like little targets. And the purpose of this is to tell the printer to register all of the layers and try to hit these targets with every print of each layer in order to get it as close as possible to what the final piece should look like. However, I'm not sure that all printers necessarily want you to use these registration marks, so you should check with them. At least for Pindot Press and for my own personal preference, I really don't like these particular registration marks. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is misregistration, and that you should build a bit of tolerance for misregistration in creating your files. And so expect that knockouts across different layers of color will not be clean, and also expect that thin overlapping lines will not overlap perfectly. So what will sometimes happen is that an artist or designer might choose to use something like red, yellow, and blue on their piece, and then when it comes to a thin line or a text with a small font, they might combine all three colors in order to create a really dark color. However, what will most likely happen is that these three layers will be misregistered, and when you have something very thin or very small, even a slight bit of misregistration might cause text to be unreadable or might cause a line drawing to look really messy. So in this case, I would just recommend going with the darkest color in your lineup, such as a red or a blue, and just using that for very thin lines or small text. So I actually created this file to show you how that works. So if we look at this file, you'll see that I have overlap teal and orange, and I have created very small knockouts of text across different font sizes. And over on the right side, I actually overlapped text across different font sizes. So when that's printed, we can see the misregistration going on. And so you'll notice that even if I registered one section of the print, another section might be misregistered because there is a skew on the Riso. And likewise, if I try to register another section of the print, probably the previously registered section will now become misregistered. So a lot of artists really enjoy this misregistration and this unpredictability aspect of the Riso, and they sometimes even incorporate that into their art or look forward to it because it does add a bit of personalization as well as just an interesting different twist to a print. If you want to anticipate how misregistration will affect your piece, one way to do that is to go into your color layer file and actually purposefully move the colors around to see how they would look with a slight bit of misregistration. So that way you can see if something starts to become really unreadable, and you can make changes ahead of time instead of getting your print and then realizing afterwards that it's really not something that you'd want. So right now, for example, up here where the font size is really small, you could see how that might start to become an issue. And also here where there's an overlap, that's pretty much how it's gonna look on the Riso with a slight bit of misregistration. So yeah, another reason why I've set up the file this way is actually to be able to print it and offer it as a reference for how different font sizes look like when they're printed on the Riso, because the Riso is a screen system, so there might be some questions as to how small it can print for it to be readable. And so with every copy of the color chart I ship out, I will just throw in a printed version of this final piece. And yeah, hopefully that'll be helpful. Alright, so we're on the home stretch here, so hopefully you've checked everything else that we have discussed previously in this video. So another very important thing to do is to provide your printer with a digital color proof, which can be as simple as just exporting your color version of your file into a JPEG and providing that to your printer. Giving the printer a color proof allows the printer to check the final printed copy against the color proof to make sure that they're very close to each other and to make sure that the final printed version is what you want it to be. Otherwise, if you just provide the printer with a grayscale file, they might not be able to tell. Another reason to provide the printer with a color proof is because sometimes, even before printing, a Riso printer can use their knowledge and experience Riso printing to check your grayscale files and make any adjustments necessary in order to get that closer to your final digital color proof. And in that way, everyone saves time and money and resources. Alright, so just some small housekeeping things. This studio actually prefers Photoshop files with each layer as its own grayscaled color and then labeled as its respective ink color versus separately exported PDFs, because what happens is sometimes we'll get PDFs that are different colors, but then they're all different sizes for some reason, like they're just not registered to each other. So keeping everything in Photoshop encourages the artist to look at the piece as a whole and to make sure everything is sized the same, and also make sure that all the layers are registered the way they want it to be. Another thing is that when you're sending a file in to be printed, you should include full specs with the file, even though you've already asked for a quote previously, because sometimes the specs do change. Sometimes the quotes are 6 to 10 emails back, and so we have to dig around for those emails, and sometimes different parts of the quote are in different emails. So it's just really confusing, and it's just a lot faster if you just include full specs such as number of colors, size, finishing, quantity, and all that pertinent information in the same email as the file. Alright, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. And if you did, please give it a like, subscribe, and leave a comment in the comment section below. And also, I'd like to say maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat sa 2,000 subscribers. At sana'y makita tayo muli sa susunod na video. Hi everyone! I'm back.
I'm back.
We're back. We're back.
Where's all the time going?
Yeah. Are you excited for Canzine, Keelan?
No.